Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Donovan Irven, who is presenting his paper, Phenomenological Reconciliation, Embodiment, and the Extended Mind.
So this conference has given me a lot to think about, and I sort of shifted directions and focus a little bit, so you'll forgive the somewhat extemporaneous exposition that I'm about to give. But that said, I sort of was thinking to come here to talk about a reconciliation between analytic philosophy, at least where philosophy of mind is concerned, and continental philosophy, particularly the phenomenological and existential traditions. So the reason I want to focus on philosophy of mind is because this is an area that's recently been receptive to continental philosophy, and particularly phenomenology. And this comes about mainly because analytic philosophy has been searching for a non-Cartesian account of the mind. 20th century analytic philosophy was bogged down in theories of computationalism, reductionisms. So under computationalism, you had a sort of central processing unit that did all of the work on sense perception and bundled it all together. You can sort of see how this is an extension of Kantianism, but also operating on the metaphor of the hardware-software, right? You have the brain, which is the hardware, and it executes the software, and it interprets the world or constructs experience. There's different strains of this and different kinds of ways to play that metaphor out. And then, of course, the reductionism. Well, we want to get rid of mental states. We want to reduce things to brain function, reduce all of the qualia to brain functioning. A lot of different versions of that. Probably the most extreme is the Churchlands, the limit of materialism. We just get rid of qualia. When I say, I'm in pain, I'm actually saying something like my C synapses are firing, and so on and so forth. Needless to say, this failed. I mean, computationalism and research programs in AI have not succeeded in producing any kind of artificial intelligence. They've never passed the Turing Test. I mean, it's just not it's not been a productive research program. This idea that you'll have some sort of like central processing unit that just solves all of the problems magically has been somewhat of a philosophical pipe dream. Interestingly enough, when people started to consider embodiment seriously and recursive functions from dynamic systems theory analysis and feedback loops where, in fact, you don't have a central processing unit, but you have many kinds of sensory input feeding into a machine that's able to produce a much higher level of operative efficacy. Machines can go around and collect bottles from the office and all that using these various inputs. And it's much more successful at producing what we might describe as autonomous action or mimicking decision-making prospects. So because of that success, people started to take this idea of embodiment seriously, and they started looking at literature on embodiment, and then they discovered Merleau-Ponty, and then they heard about phenomenology all of a sudden, and it didn't. And now, oh boy, we can talk about this stuff. But there's still some reticence in analytic philosophy to fully open up this can of worms just because of the institutional politics that have gone into the analytic-continental divide over the years. But this search for non-Cartesianism, I mean, you can trace this back to Gilbert Ryle and The Ghost in the Machine. And many of you probably know Gilbert Ryle has actually reviewed Heidegger's Being in Time. And although he was very skeptical of the phenomenological research project, he had high praise. I just want to remind people of this because I find it interesting. So Gilbert Ryle, in his review, said, of Being in Time, said, it is a very difficult and important work, which marks a big advance in the application of the phenomenological method. Though I may say at once I suspect that this advance is an advance towards disaster. maybe Heidegger would like that, I don't know. But then he goes on at the end to say, but though I deplore the damage wrought upon metaphysics by the presuppositions which Heidegger has unconsciously inherited, I have nothing but admiration for his special undertaking and for such of his achievements in it as I can follow, namely the phenomenological analysis of the root workings of the human soul. He shows himself to be a thinker of real importance, by the immense subtlety and searchingness of his examination of consciousness, by the boldness and originality of his methods and conclusions, and by the unflagging energy which he tries to think behind the stock categories of orthodox philosophy and psychology. And I must also say in his behalf that while it is my personal opinion that qua first philosophy, phenomenology is at present heading for bankruptcy and disaster, it will end either in self-ruinous subjectivism or in a windy mysticism, perhaps a little foresight there in terms of people's critique of Heidegger, right? I hazard this opinion with humility and with reservations, since I am well aware of how far I have fallen short of understanding this difficult work. So I think as a sidebar, it would be interesting to sort of construct a minor literature on phenomenology within analytic philosophy, sort of to use Deleuze's idea of a minor literature. Would be an interesting project, but I digress. So this rediscovery of phenomenology within analytic circles, or at least among analytically trained people, is interesting because I frame it this way, saying, oh, well, you know, they're looking for non-Cartesian explanations for mind. Well, wait a minute. Husserl, who all of these people like to cite and talk about, was a Cartesian, right? I mean, Cartesian meditations. He starts with the ego, you know. He goes on and he accepts that sort of spot, and he's not a dualist, right? I don't mean Cartesian in that sense, but he has this idea of the ego as this, and you could maybe draw an analogy between the ego and this sort of central processing unit, that there's this one point that's in relation to the world that from which my intentionality is directed. Interestingly, I think exactly what happens and what shows the efficacy of Husserl's phenomenology, which I wanted to maybe apply some definitions of this so we're not just sort of spinning our wheels. So Sokolowski calls phenomenology the study of human experience and of the ways things present themselves to us in and through such experience. Smith says the study of structures of consciousness is experienced from the first person point of view. Moran says way of seeing, what appears to be as such, the manner of its appearing and the how of its manifestation. That's sort of a paraphrase of Husserl. From itself in the very way in which it shows itself from itself, which is a little more difficult to sort of grasp. Now, this definition is different from phenomenological methodology, which I want to try to sort of suggest that it actually has something very much in common with analytic philosophy, which is that it's a rigorous conceptual analysis, and that roots it in hermeneutics. So I think Heidegger is moving in the right direction, right? And when I say conceptual analysis, the concepts by which our experience is structured, right? What does Heidegger call the project of being in time? Dasein analysis, right? It's a rigorous sort of analysis that I think has some more connections, and I hope that people will argue with me about that and talk a little bit more with me about that later, because it's I'm sort of venturing it here as a response to last night's talk and some of the things that we talked about after the fact, right? So what does Husserl sort of attempt to do this? What does his interpretation of our experience yield? Interestingly, I think it breaks down upon the examination of the inner subjectivity. He moves along very smoothly with very interesting results with the ego as his basis until in the fifth meditations of his Cartesian meditations, when all of a sudden this sort of infinite gap opens up between myself and the other. And I'm not saying that Husserl is not concerned with inner subjectivity. He does a lot of really good work, and he's obviously very sympathetic to it. But the account that he gives, the intentional account, doesn't support the kind of philosophical work he wants inner subjectivity to do. So I think actually the failure of Husserl to account for this is actually a positive result of phenomenology, because it opens the door to the dissolution of the ego. So one of the first and most important contributions of phenomenology is exactly the dissolution of the ego, and this is where Heidegger gets going. This is an actual result of phenomenological analysis, this loss of ego, I will say. Now, so of course, I want to sort of qualify this. Husserl's Cartesianism is a Cartesianism in the shadow of Kant, right? So when I say the dissolution of the ego, when we turn phenomenological analysis inside, it's similar to Hume's concern, right? That like, oh, I don't see this ego, I don't have any experience of this ego, I get this sort of constant shift in experience. And that's exactly why if Husserl's analysis leads us to sort of mimic that argument, well, then it's no surprise that Heidegger turns to Kant and says in the preface to the third edition of the Kant book, I sought in Kant the answer to the questions I sought, and I sought it exactly in the schematism where the categories were put into relationship with time. So, just some historical notes. Heidegger basically thinks Husserl hasn't been phenomenological enough, right? He still has all this conceptual baggage that he gets from Cartesian analysis. Now, let's, why am I talking about all this stuff of phenomenology, and how does that relate to the analytic philosophers? Well, it's exactly in this embedded, extended, enactive, and embodied sort of theory of mind that phenomenology gets the most play. Sean Gallagher, Dan Zahavi, Evan Thompson, so on and so forth, all of these people. I want to focus on Mark Rowlands because he's particularly interested in phenomenology, and he gives the sort of most direct treatment of Heidegger. Andy Clark names his book Being There, has a throwaway reference to Heidegger in the first page, and then spends the next 140 pages talking about robots. And of course, Heidegger would just say, well, you're leveling down, this is just technologically driven, mediated, computational, there's no, it's still too wedded to the particular science and not ontological enough. The reason that Rowlands is interesting to me is because he takes embodiedness and extendedness, extended mind, to be the important things we're working with. So when we talk about extended mind, we're trying to move beyond that sort of inside the head computational approach, right? The brain, the cranial container is not necessarily important. And under Rowland's reading and several others, when I engage with the world, my engagement with certain objects in the world that are not part of my body are constitutive of cognitive function. They don't contribute to it. My mental functioning doesn't depend upon them. The actual manipulation of object is constitutive of cognition, right? This is a claim about the kind of entity that cognitive acts are. Now, I want to rein this in a little bit. It's not as if my pen is always a part of the mind. No, it's a part of the mind when I'm using it in a process, right? It's procedural, it's process. Embeddedness for Rowlands doesn't cut it, right? You can be embedded in a context, you can be embedded in a world, but you can still sort of just use that as something that the mind sort of clings onto or globs onto. Enactivism doesn't cut it because, yeah, I can use things and I can pick them up, but that's not necessarily constitutive. He claims that embodiedness and extendedness is constitutive of the act. Now, where Rowland starts to sort of take a misstep is when he identifies this as ontic. Well, if you've sort of done your work to sort of dissolve the ego and to move beyond the container metaphor, you've actually lapsed into a kind of ontological position where you're starting to talk about the conditions of the possibility for something like what we want to call mind to arise, or something like these cognitive acts can arise. Now, the reason I think he makes some of these missteps, and the reason why they're still talking about mind as almost like a kind of entity, right? They make these caveats to process, and they make these, sort of, we want to be non-Cartesian, but they're still sort of talking about this nebulous sort of entity that we want to call mind. I want to really argue that they need to take the plunge. They see Heidegger as like a can of worms, or they see Merleau-Ponty as a can of worms, and they want to like point at the can of worms and say, oh, here's some interesting things, let me sort of pull some labels off of it and patch it in here. I say, buy the can of worms, take it home, open it up, let them run out, it's great, you'll find a lot of really great conceptual resources to do the work. The thing that makes me say this is that Rowlands claims, despite all of his, he claims that one of the fundamental features of mind is not that it's intentional, it's not that it does these cognitive processes, it's that it's revelatory, it's disclosure, and it's this play on concealing and unconcealing, right? As I direct my attention toward the pen, other things are concealed, other things fall away, other things are highlighted, and this sort of plays on an old Gibson, sort of was a reviled biologists, I guess back in the day, we had this notion of affordances, right? That the environment afforded me certain opportunities given my very particular relationship with it. So I am the kind of thing that can drink water, and a pool of water affords me the opportunity to drink it. And this circumvents certain subject-object problems, because it's not as if the subject purely determines the object, or that the object purely determines the subject, but that there's what Deleuze would call a mutual presupposition. There's an interdependency, an interpenetration there, in which both things mutually form one another. The subject affects the environment affects the subject. There's this kind of feedback loop, and they both influence and inform one another. It's a more robust picture, and one that allows us to sort of circumvent some of these sticky issues with subject and object. And so this notion of the, again, since the ego has fallen away, we can't just rely on the subject to do all the work then and fall back on the subject-object dichotomy. We need a sort of more mutually formative thing. And this is exactly the kind of work I think that phenomenology, and I think it's probably been obvious that my emphasis has been on Heidegger here. That's the exact thing that we want mind to do. And that's the exact thing that these analytics are trying to account for. Now, this is not a new idea, right? This idea of a disclosure is not new. I think Heidegger would be happy to hear me say that we could go back to the Greeks and find some insight into this. And not just Greek philosophy, but go back even further to Greek literature, to Homer. Homer, I did a sort of a look through Homer's Iliad and Odyssey to see where nous, the term we translate for mind, is used. About 36 instances of it being attributed to characters in the Odyssey, about 48 or so in the Iliad. Used for all different ways: judgment, planning, intentional purposefulness, but also to be disclosed, something that you share with people, to take counsel with others, to open up and put forth. Also wit. And so I'll close with a little bit of poetics, also from a Homeric hymn to Hermes, the hermenoid, right? The messenger of the gods, where we get the word hermeneutics. Hermes, one of his most defining features was his wit, his nous. And it's with this nous that he made the turtles sing. And so Hermes' nous changed the world in such a way that it opened up new possibilities, new affordances, new ways of being for humans. He made the turtles sing. And so I would suggest to the analytics that through continental philosophy, through the phenomenological and existential tradition, we can explain bodily emplacement, and through this bodily emplacement and cognitive extension into the world, we ourselves make the world sing. Thank you.
I'm having some difficulty with your use of affordances. Your reference to presupposition steps. The problem I have is that it seems to me that the water pool does not presuppose a water drinker.
Okay.
So this almost interagency of some kind of presupposition for each. The water pool seems to lack what would be needed for that kind of co-presupposition of status. It seems.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit too much of a totalized view of it. It's when the two things come into relation with one another. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The pool doesn't provide it's not always there to be drank from. But when certain kinds of beings enter into their relationship with the pool becomes the kind of thing that can be drank from. But it is that in virtue of its relation to some other thing that's in the world with it. And it defines also the way in which that thing can drink from it. So it's only when the two are brought into conjunction with one another that the mutual presupposition holds. It's not a totalitizing thing that is at all places at all times. It's a kind of a historical ontology, to use Ian Hacking's phrase.
Did think of the pool of water too much as being in itself then?
I think so. And I want to suggest, and I can't fully articulate this yet, but I think that we can pursue this toward making more robust metaphysical claims through phenomenology, because there's less of a problem with this, like, well, the subject is inside of itself and cut off from the world. But that's still sort of formative in my thoughts, and I'm doing some research on that now, so, but I hope that's helpful.
As a starting place, yes, thank you.
Thanks. Yes?
So basically, I was wondering, like, can you explain more about your, say, standpoint on Husserl's account of intersubjectivity in David's meditation? Because I feel like, see, I agree with you that we should, as Continental philosophers, we should give more credit to analytic philosophy, like in particular in a lecture like to cognitive science. But the thing is that within cognitive science, they also have this, say, transcendental agenda, or can they do transcendental philosophy? And the thing is that even though you mentioned about, say, yes, we all know in the transcendental tradition we have maybe Descartes, but definitely Kant and Husserl, but they are very different. In a nutshell, I will just list 2 points. First, in Kant, there is no account of intentionality in consciousness. Second, in Kant, intuition per se cannot give us objective validity, but in Husserl, intuition can. So I think they are very different. We cannot just ignore the differences among them. And so basically my question is, so I hope to hear more of your explication of intersubjectivity.
Yeah. It's tricky in Husserl, because Husserl is so sympathetic to it and acknowledging of, like, all of the important roles that intersubjectivity plays, and he does a lot of good work with it elsewhere. But my claim is that when he tries to substantiate that, when he tries to give us the intentional account of intersubjectivity, that ends up collapsing because of the distance between egos, right? And so he starts to say, how do I know that there are other people out there that are like me? Well, I perform this sort of comparative analysis. And this is why people, I think, mistakenly critique Husserl for saying, oh, well, you're just reducing them to the same. I don't think that he's necessarily reducing them to the same. And then he makes the pairing, right? He tries to go through this sort of convoluted path where I say, well, I encounter the other person, but I don't have access to their intentional stance, so I do this pairing function, and then I say, well, they must be like me in some way, so I can reasonably infer that they have this sort of like intentional stance as well. And for me, that just doesn't ring phenomenologically true. I think when Heidegger's talking about encountering others, he's just better at that, right? I don't encounter some person-like thing out in the world. I encounter someone as something that I can relate to and talk with, and as a speaker of language, and as, you know, I can go, I see the person working and they're at work, you know. They're not something that I encounter, and then I have to be like, well, wait a minute. Do you have this internal intentionality? So I don't know if that's helpful, but for me, when Husserl starts to talk about this intersubjective stuff, within his discourse, this like distance opens up between myself and the other person, and he's in a position where he has to account for like an infinite gap in this leap to then postulate that there's an existence of the other there. And I just don't, I think he fails on that count.
I'm sorry, but I think I don't think Husserl fails. But the difference is that Heidegger criticized Husserl for his transcendental agenda.
Yeah.
Because for Heidegger, like, there is no such thing as one transcendental word, one empirical word. There is only one word. That is the word of Donovan. That's the word of we, and we are being together.
For Heidegger?
For Heidegger,
Okay.
in Husserl, there is that transcendental agenda, and when he talks about intersubjectivity, he never says that I could be the other person. When he talks about like the pairing, the apprehension and appresentation, he's talking about transcendental possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate what you're saying. But under the phenomenological analysis that he's doing, he can't postulate the ontological entity, or he's not being true to he can't postulate its ontological status. He can't make a claim about whether or not it exists, or he's not staying true to his own methodology. And I have to respectfully disagree. Heidegger clearly says there's multiple worlds. There's a world, there's not just one world. There's a world of carpentry, a world of this, and a world, you know, and they are connected to a totality of references that we engage when we take up a project or equipment within that world. So I'd love to talk more about it though. We'll go to Eric.
In 1 minute.
Oh, okay, last.
As concise as you can be.
Okay.
Or we can talk later.
Just one thing I would say, well, sort of so I'm wondering, your sort of concept, this is a different line, but I have the same sort of concern now. I guess we'll talk more about that later, but, well, also the one thing is, you have to deal with, you have to read the crisis if you have, because, I mean, he says explicitly, I'm not a Cartesian, you basically abandon Cartesian parts, so you have to declare evidence in your book called Cartesian meditation to say that this is Cartesian, but the point I'm sort of wondering is that, what do you think that the analytic philosophy of mind will embrace from the Heideggerian approach? Like so I mean, the reason I think about this is, so we mentioned like Sahabi and Thompson, and I admire their work, and there's something that they're doing, their Husserlian or Merleau-Ponty approach that the sort of the philosophy of mind and analytic approach has embraced, right? And I don't see those who do analytic mind embracing the notion of revelatory disclosure as adding anything to sort of philosophy of mind. So I'm sort of wondering what you expect the sort of what's your understanding of the need where the analytic philosophy of mind will embrace Heidegger?
I've read The Crisis, and as long as Husserl is held to the idea of an ego, a transcendental ego, and that's the basis of his intentional analysis, that's Cartesian, whether or not he wants to wear that label or not.
So when he said explicitly you have to abandon the Cartesian method, that doesn't do it for you? At the end of the first section?
Yeah, it's not a question of his method, it's a question of the kinds of entities he's postulating as being the ground of identity and the intentional stance. Rollins himself, as far as the second part goes, Rollins just says that mind is revelatory, so I don't think that, that's not what I want him to get from the Continentals. He's already there on that point. What I want him to do with the Continentals is follow that through, admit that he's dealing with sort of ontological issues, because he's no longer trying to describe like an entity that's encapsulated in a body. He's now trying to describe the world as such, as the conditions of the possibility for the emergence of some kind of extended mind that is...
We continue this in the open session, but we should